Greetings, my name is Beabout, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I thought it'd be fun to do another album comparison video. This time, I will be looking at two albums by Marillion. The 1988 album, Clutching at Straws, the fourth Marillion album, and the final to feature original lead singer Fish, and we'll also be looking at Season's End, the 1989 album, which is the first to feature singer Steve Hogarth. I'm going to talk about mostly my experience with both of these works because they are quite different. They're different in a lot of meaningful ways. Marillion were and are a significant neo-progressive rock group hailing from England. The UK, I guess, is a more general term. So by this point in the band's history, they had pretty much cemented their classic lineup, that being Fish on vocals, Steve Rothery on guitar, Pete Trewavis on bass, Mark Kelly on keyboards, and Ian Mosley on drums. And they had already achieved international success with the release of the Misplaced Childhood album, and specifically the songs Kaylee and Lavender. They were at the top of their game commercially and musically, and there was a ton of record company pressure to churn out hit after hit after hit. And I think through Fish's dealings with alcoholism and difficulty with dealing with fame, he kind of self-imploded, and a lot of the lyrical content from this album comes from that. And I actually find this to be one of the album's strengths. That, I think, sets them apart from other progressive rock bands who often wrote about fantasy elements and stuff that was not particularly grounded, whereas, this album deals with very human and very personal issues, and it does so in the form of a concept album, much like Pink Floyd's The Wall. In fact, when I was considering making this comparison video, I nearly changed it to comparing Clutching at Straws to The Wall, because both seem to be about the isolation of fame, or in other words, isolating oneself due to fame, the inability to deal with that, with the pressure. I will admit, I've liked it for a number of years. I've spent a lot more time with this album, and I have kind of cemented myself as being a major Fish fan. What you have here is an album that starts to build right from the opening, and it sets atmosphere, and you hear ferocious guitar playing from Steve Rothery, which is a big signature of this band. In fact, I think if I were to point to my favorite thing about this band, it probably is Steve Rothery's guitar playing. He's somewhere among the Steve Hackett's, the Andy Latimers, Dave Gilmour. He's in that kind of atmospheric feeling, wall of sound kind of guitar playing. It's not technical. It's very lyrical, and it's very beautiful. And he has moments of ferocity, and he has moments of just tenderness that are heartbreaking. And bass player Pete Trewavis is very understated. You never feel like the bass is taking the center stage. It's always in support of the music, but I feel like he's a very important part of this band's groove. And also in this category, Ian Mosley, I think, is an incredibly underrated drummer. In a way, he reminds me of Jerry Conway. He's consistent. He plays only what the song needs. He's never really flashy or showy, but he's rock solid. Even though it does get intense at times, and some of the singing from Fish in particular is very intense. It kind of brings back that lonely feeling that I get from that side three of The Wall, with songs like Hey You, Nobody Home, even Comfortably Numb, but it's still like its own thing. And a lot of that, again, has to do with the lyrics, which read like poetry. When you sit down and actually read Fish's lyrics, they're so caked in meaning and double meaning that they read as well as they're sung. This album is so focused in its concept. Just for the record, I can put it down anytime. Anybody who's suffered any kind of addiction, whether it's drinking, whether it's food, whatever it is, shopping, anybody will say, well, I can put that down. I can quit anytime. This album is more concerned with asking the questions and painting an atmosphere, telling a story, than it is solving the problems or coming to a conclusion. White Russian is one of my absolute favorite Marillion songs ever. It might be my favorite song on this album. This seems to be more outward looking. A lot of Fish stuff tends to look inward, but this is very political. This is about fascism, how fascism never goes away. You can shut your eyes, you can hide it away, but it's going to come back someday. And that's just such a cutting and vivid lyric. And it's true. It's one of those things that we might pretend it doesn't exist, but it always is going to exist somewhere. I like the idea of a guy sitting in a bar and contemplating the greater problems in the world. And I think that this keeps Fish, his lyrics, from falling into some of the self-loathing category or the overwrought category, because he is aware of issues beyond himself. This is one of my favorite albums ever. And you can understand why, when we get to the next one, at first, I had a little bit of difficulty. Fish feels suffocated by the fame and the expectations. He can't handle it anymore. And during the mixing of the Thieving Magpie album, he jumps ship. He decides to leave, leaving Marillion to have to pick up the pieces. Luckily, they had a lot of material written already, because I think there was this misconception, much like when Peter Gabriel left Genesis, that Fish did everything. But in reality, Marillion wrote the music. So they had that strength behind them. They already had a collection of ideas and songs kind of composed. It was just a matter of finding lyricists. So the band contacted a couple of actual poets to contribute lyrics, because they knew that Marillion fans liked the lyrical aspect, and that was important. And I think that was a smart idea, because what you get is, with the exception of White Russian, a lot of Fish's lyrics look inward, but I feel like the lyrics on Season's End are more looking outward. This is more global concerns, political concerns. They found Steve Hogarth, and Steve Hogarth was basically unknown, I think, at the time, although he did have other groups that he was involved with. I guess they just heard his voice on a cassette that the record company had sent and decided to try him out, and they liked what they heard. I do want to thank a commenter who sent this in. So I'd never heard this album before, and that was kind of the impetus for this video. But when I first heard it, I really was not sure what to think. I didn't like Steve Hogarth's voice. I had trouble connecting to the lyrics because I had trouble hearing them. It's not like Fish, where the lyrics are very clear and easy to understand for me. There was something about his voice that made them a little bit more muffled. And so it took a little while to kind of sink in. I actually listened to this album when I drove past my childhood home that I left about 2 years ago. And it was a very kind of depressing experience. It wasn't as happy as I'd hoped it would be. And what I drew from it was the message that change was necessary, that I needed that to grow. Now, isn't that interesting how that ties into the switch from Fish to Steve Hogarth. It almost makes me think of Doctor Who. Usually when you get into Doctor Who, you really like an actor, a specific actor, and you kind of get used to all of his little quirks and witticisms and how he reacts in a situation. In my case, it was Peter Capaldi. Peter Capaldi was the Doctor who really won my heart, and is the Doctor who I compare every Doctor to before or since. And so eventually, if you're a Doctor Who fan, the actor leaves, usually after only a few years, and they have to recast the Doctor. And you'll start watching the new Doctor, and at first you think, she's not as good, or he's not as good as Peter Capaldi. They're not as good as Matt Smith. They're not as good as Tom Baker. He's fine, but he's no Tom Baker. You know what I mean? But over time, you start to realize they have their own charms. They have their own gifts. And that's my experience with this album, is learning through experiencing my own changes, upheaval, realizing that it's necessary for growth. That's my own experience with this album, and beginning to see that Marillion with Hogarth has its own charms. There's positives to be had here. There's things to be gleaned from the change. So the King of Sunset Town kind of reminds me a little bit of Hotel Hobbies, actually, because it's a very ambient start, and then it builds and builds and builds and kicks into a guitar solo. And some of the actual rhythms and the way that they are played kind of takes me back to the Clutching at Straws era. Now, Steve Hogarth's voice is a lot more breathy, and it doesn't have as much attack as Fish. It's a duller sound, but somehow that serves this music, because even with Marillion with Fish, the band has more of an attack, but I feel like they're a little softer on this album in general, and that was something that was difficult for me to get used to at first. But I started hearing the songs, and I started sitting down and getting into the lyrics. And this is about the Tiananmen Square massacre. It occurred right in the middle of writing and recording this song. And although it was written by an outside lyricist, Steve Hogarth changed it. He changed the meaning to make it fit current events. And, I had trouble with this song at first. It wasn't like an immediate love. But the more I listened to it, the more it kind of resonated. But it's the next song, Easter, that won me over. And it wasn't, and again, when I was listening to this and thinking, oh, this isn't like Misplaced Childhood, Steve Hogarth isn't like Fish, I didn't like it. But when I started listening to it for what it was and is, I appreciated it a lot more. And Easter is this just lovely, folksy, Irish-influenced ballad that I guess Steve Hogarth himself wrote and brought to the band. And I think that's the reason why, to me, his voice fits better on this song. Sometimes on this album, I hate to admit this, but I think Steve Hogarth is pushing himself just a little bit out of his range. Maybe subsequent albums, they got a little bit better with that. And again, this could be because the material was written before Hogarth was actually a part of the band. So maybe if they wrote stuff specifically for him, or stuff that was written by him, works better, at least for me. And this is a case of that, where I think that Hogarth's voice works really well with Easter. And it's such a lovely track. Again, Steve Rothery is saving the day for me with those, that wonderfully recorded acoustic guitar sound. It's just beautiful. Textbook recording techniques, as far as I'm concerned. Easter has one of my all-time favorite Steve Rothery guitar solos. He really rips on Easter. And this is one of those cases where I cannot compare it to anything else. This is purely Steve Rothery. It doesn't really sound that much like Dave Gilmour or Steve Hackett or any of his influences. It sounds like purely him. And I think Easter is one of my favorite songs on either of these albums. That's how much I like it. Then you have this moment where the band kind of joins in and adds this 5/4 section. and you have Mark Kelly playing those keyboards. And you know, I'm always kind of mixed on Mark Kelly. I think he's a great keyboardist, but some of his tones come across a little dated to me. And this could be connected with the time period and the technology of the time. But I do like his presence on this track. I like this little wordless vocal melody that Steve Hogarth puts in, and it gets stuck in my head all the time. I really think Easter is an album highlight. We move on to the title track, Season's End, which is this wonderful Here Comes the Flood style warning about climate change. And, you know, as one of the members of the band pointed out, nothing's changed. You know, the warnings happened 30 years ago, and we haven't done anything about it. And I think that that's maybe the most depressing thing about this song. I like how this is the beginning of kind of the more progressive thing coming back in, as it's a very atmospheric piece that takes you on a little journey. And by the time you get to the end of it, it's solemn. It's a little bit depressing, but it's very beautiful. Berlin, I think, is a masterpiece. You want to talk about atmosphere. This paints a picture of a state of being in the same way that Clutching of Straws does, because by the time you get to the end of Clutching of Straws, it's just painted a picture. It's just told you what the problems are. It doesn't offer any solutions. It lets you sit with that. And I feel like Berlin is similar in that it just kind of paints a picture of the city, but it doesn't try to add any commentary of its own. And I really like that about it. I like tonally what Berlin does. There's a tonal shift because up until this point, there's not really been a whole lot of outside contributions on Marillion records, but the sax solo here is really nice. And this was an inspired choice by producer Nick Davis. And I think that the sax in many ways mixes better with Steve Hogarth's voice than the guitar does. That was always something that I loved about Fish Marillion, was that Fish's voice and Steve Rothery's guitar could interplay with one another. It's kind of a Pink Floyd thing again, like Dick Perry and Shine On You Crazy Diamond. But it's a really lovely moment. And I kind of wish that they did a little more of that. Bass player Pete Truevis said that he felt like this is a song that Marillion were expected to do. And I can kind of get that. It does kind of sound like a classic Marillion epic. But I think it's good that they included something like this, because when you change singers like this and your singer is a charismatic poet, I think you have to go to some extent to try to keep those old fans. And just think about how hard of a time I had with this 30 years on. Just imagine being there at the time. You know, you do want to keep some sort of sense of familiarity. Hooks in You, this is Marillion going for Van Halen mode. It's a little bit shameless. At first, I wasn't sure how to feel about it because it's very hard rock in a 1989 sort of way. But what saves it for me is Mr. Steve Rothery. Once again, my Marillion MVP. I think that his riff on this is incredible, and it's close to Martin Barre. It kind of reminds me of some of the stuff Martin Barre played in the mid '80s. And that's a good thing. Like, Martin Barre is one of my favorite guitarists. This is a cool song. It's catchy, it's short, it's brief. It's got a lot of mixed time signatures for a song like this, which is nice to hear. It's one of those songs that at first I was like, ooh, this is too commercial, but kind of the more I listen to the playing and the actual quality of the writing, I've grown to find this one of my favorite. It's a disc highlight again. So finally, we get to my favorite song on the album, which is The Space. Again, this is a song that Steve Hogarth contributed a lot of writing to, so I think his voice fits a lot better within it. And I like the Led Zeppelin Kashmir style strings. I assume that's Mark Kelly bringing that in. But that's one of my favorite things in this song. And I love the last section where he's singing about everybody in the whole world, hurts and feels the same way. And I can't remember exactly what the lyric is, but repeating that like a mantra is super powerful. It does compete with The Last Straw in a kind of a similar way as like an extended workout, progressive in nature that also ties everything together. So, okay, Season's End. It's not as strong as a concept as Clutching at Straws. I am still having difficulty grappling with Steve Hogarth as a vocalist at times. At times, he reminds me of Peter Gabriel a little bit. At times, he reminds me of Mark Hollis of Talk Talk a little bit. And in the final moments of The Space, believe it or not, he makes me think of Sting of The Police. I think you can tell why the band stuck with him all these years, because he does fit them well. That being said, I think in my heart, I'm always going to prefer Clutching at Straws. I just think that this is a much more emotionally stirring record. It's a much more conceptual record that's deeply thought out and is thematically tied. It's so focused. I can't think of another concept album that's as focused as Clutching at Straws. Sometimes it is a daunting listen, much in the way that later 70s Pink Floyd albums are, but there's something raw and compelling about Fish singing his heart out and exploring these themes of addiction. There's the feeling, particularly with Marillion's use of outside writers on Season's End, that a lot of the lyrics, while thinking globally, thinking politically, don't really draw that much upon experience. I think it's a more personal touch on the Clutching at Straws album. And maybe this might make some folks uncomfortable, but for me, it makes it so much more relatable. I feel like when I'm listening to Clutching at Straws that I am sitting at a bar, sharing a drink, passing stories with Fish. And I think that is a real strength of this album. And the playing itself seems much more impassioned to me on Clutching at Straws. Now, I realize that this wasn't a happy time for the band, but I hear just a little bit more energy and conviction in the performances themselves. They're both excellent records. I am grateful to have and to listen to both and to continue discovering them. So, I think that wraps up just about all I had to say about these two albums. What are your thoughts? How do you feel Clutching at Straws and Season's End compare? Which one is your favorite? Please let me know in the comments. I would love to open up a dialogue with you about some of this great music. Don't forget also that if you enjoyed this video to like it. And if you could spare a few moments to subscribe to the channel, I'd really appreciate that. Right now, I'm trying to make it to 1,000 subscribers, and I'm about 300 away from being able to do that. Once I reach 1,000, I will be able to do live streams, which is something that my friend Mike and I are excited about because we haven't done any kind of live anything since the Prog Rock Deep Cuts days. In the description, I have included a link to my Amazon wish list, should you like to support the channel with a donation. There are a number of Marillion records included. One that I'm rather interested in is Brave. I would love to hear Brave because I've heard that it's a Hogarth era album that's as strong as Fish. And I would like to hear Hogarth a little bit more integrated into the writing process because I do feel like on some of these songs, again, he's pushing himself just a little bit too much. And I would like to hear him integrated more organically into the writing process. I think that would be interesting to hear. All right, that's it for me for today, but you will see and hear from me really soon. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching.